Welcome to the Corporate Detox podcast. I'm your host, Amanda McWhorter. I'm a corporate dropout, recovering people pleaser and perfectionist turned burnout recovery coach. If you are sick of the corporate roller coaster ride and ready to step into a life you love, this is the podcast for you. Okay, welcome back to the Corporate Detox podcast. I'm your host, Amanda McWhorter, and with me today, I have Tali Schlaffer. And I am so excited for you guys to get to hear all of her amazingness, quite honestly, because I came across you in a group, and I started looking at your content, and I was cracking up at just how relatable it was. And I'm like, I have got to have this girl on the podcast. So I'm going to turn it over to you to do your intro, and you can also jump into your corporate detox story.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Amanda. Hey, everybody. My name is Tali Schlaffer. I'm an interview coach, and it's my job to help high-achieving professionals build communication skills and confidence that they need to stand out and really wow their interviewers so they can land that dream job. One of the things that I really believe is that your interviews aren't just about what you say or your message. They're also very much about your mindset. That is equally important in order to really represent yourself and build a compelling case for why you should get hired. So I really believe in having a compassionate, very straightforward tips on how to interview prep. Everything I do is rooted in communication fundamentals. So it's stuff that you can apply in your day-to-day life too. I'm very active on TikTok, social media, Facebook, Instagram. That's where Amanda was saying that she was following me along. And one of my favorite things is to share interview tips. And I've amassed over 6 million tips since starting this, 6 million views since starting this back in the spring. That's when I really decided, hey, I'm going to help people with their interviews. There's a real big need for that. So I've had quite a few reels go viral. So it's really clearly striking a chord with a lot of folks. And then I've also helped dozens of people land jobs that they're really excited for in this pretty tough market, just by figuring out how do we build a more compelling case for ourselves to really help our interviewer understand why we're the best possible hire for them. So that's a little bit about me. I'm still figuring out my own spiel. You know, I always talk about how to answer the tell me about yourself question. And to be completely honest and transparent with folks, I'm still working on that out in my business. So it's kind of, communication is a constantly evolving thing, I think. So diving into my corporate detox story. So right out of college, I was always super, super driven, motivated, type A person, right? If you think of that person, that's probably me in college. And right out of college, I studied business administration and marketing, started interviewing for internships, started interviewing for jobs out of college. And I ended up landing a very prestigious consulting job. I'm not going to name the company. I'm not here to, trash talk anybody, but one of the big four consulting groups, ended up working for them. And I was really excited. I got the job offer back in January, and I was going to be starting in September. And all year I was super excited. It was really prestigious, right? You're going to a business school, even if it's undergrad, a big name like that carries a lot of prestige. And I very quickly realized, once I started the job, after all this buildup of telling people, oh, I'm going to be working for this big four consulting, and having all the hype and the prestige around that, within the first day on the job, I realized that it's not going to be a good fit for me. I went off and did their training, and it was fantastic, and I learned so much, and I met these really amazing people. Throughout that summer, there were a lot of onboarding events. I was really excited about the people that I was going to be working with. But as soon as I got assigned a project and I showed up to the job itself, that very same day, I was still living at home trying to find an apartment for myself. That same day, I came home to my mom after like a 12-hour day and just broke down in tears, because I immediately knew that this is not an environment that I want to work with, that I want to work in. This is not somewhere that I can actually succeed. And the summer before that, funny enough, the summer before that job, I had an internship at T-Mobile, which I ended up working for 5 years. I'm kind of jumping between my stories. Had my internship at T-Mobile, was really excited about working there. They couldn't offer me an extension for the following year, so I ended up going to this consulting firm. And at this firm, I think a lot of people can succeed there, but I learned during my internship at T-Mobile that I'm a 40-hour-a-week girly, right? Like that to me hits the sweet spot. When I was working at, this was kind of my dream company, T-Mobile, because they just had such an amazing workplace culture. I really felt supported. They were talking about diversity and inclusion, I think, before it was popular or before it was a cool buzzword that was part of, became necessary. They were really forward thinking in a lot of the ways that they treated their employees. And that's what I had gotten used to all that summer. I was used to feeling really supported, feeling like there's a lot of open communication on the team. And then that was my first experience working in corporate, was this internship that I had that I just loved and adored and would have loved to come back to. And so then going out and going into my first job and looking around, realizing, okay, 60-hour work weeks are the norm here. That was the big red flag for me. It's like everybody was talking about 60-hour work weeks. And jobs will have a 60-hour work week every now and then, right? Like every job has its crunch times. That's fine, but that was the norm, right? You weren't allowed to complain unless you're working over 60 hours. And those are some of the things that I started picking up on that first day, was just how people talked about their job. I really felt like there was the hustle culture was really, really big. I don't think we even had a term for hustle culture back then. I'm really glad people have more of a vocabulary for that now. But just realizing the manager that I was reporting to, she was the only other woman on the team, right? We had a team of 12 consultants, very masculine, and I'm a very masculine person, like in my demeanor, in my a few different areas in my life. But for lack of a better word, the toxic masculinity was very much there. On the first day of the job, I remember the people who were working, we were consulting for a company. And so the employees at the company all left to go at 5 p.m. They all went home to pick up their kids, whatever, as you do, right? They were working at 9 to 5 and they left at 5 p.m. And I remember the people on my team at the firm that I was working at were making fun of them for that. Like they were saying basically they don't take their jobs as seriously because they don't work those crazy long hours that we do. And that to me was like, no, I refuse. It was so repelling to me to hear people, first of all, badmouth others for wanting to pick up their kids from school. Like that was so backwards in my mind. And secondly, just for having normalized this experience of, hey, we're going to work a 60-hour work week, and that's how you measure success. The other thing that, so just hearing how people talked about the employees on the other side, like hearing how the contractors were talking about the employees kind of behind their back, that was hugely off-putting to me. It felt disingenuous. I don't like disliking people. I don't like, judging people. Everybody judges people, but to be so blatant about it, to normalize this culture of, we have to work crazy hours. And the other thing that was a huge red flag for me was that the manager that I was working with, the manager on that team, I was kind of being her assistant throughout this project, right? We were keeping track of this huge Excel sheet of different moving bits and pieces that I won't bore you with, but she was working on getting her MBA, right? That's kind of the next step. She was the person that I would become if I stayed at this company long enough. I think she was 3 or 4 years ahead of me. She was on the track to getting her MBA and getting it reimbursed, etc. And I looked at her and I was like, this cannot be my future. She was constantly shaking in anxiety. She couldn't take any time off. She was on all around the clock. There was not an hour at which she was not responding to emails during the weekends, during the evenings, up at crazy hours. She was working, I don't know, she must have been working 70+ hour weeks. And there was no gratitude for it. There was no sense of, thank you so much. This is not a normal thing. Thank you for committing this time. It was the expectation and the norm. And just seeing how stressed she was. You can tell when somebody's really stressed and on edge. And this was, I worked with her for 2 months, and just seeing that this is the norm. She took a vacation. This was one of the one of the breaking points that I had, but she was scheduled to take I think it was either a long weekend or a week off to go to Hawaii with her partner. And we tried to offload as much as possible, right? So that she didn't have to work, took her laptop, worked the entire time. It was as if there was no break in business at all. And I was like, what's the point of this? What's the point of making, it was an impressive amount of money out of college, and it was really prestigious, but I was like, I don't want to live just to work. Like, there was the definition of the opposite of what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my first detox story. And the reason that I was able to get out of that is the summer before, I was really, when I was interning at T-Mobile, I was super diligent about networking. And by networking, I mean meeting people, meeting up with them for coffee, asking about their work, asking about, what it's like to work there, what they like and don't like about their jobs, building those relationships. I think networking is, that's a buzzword that scares a lot of people. So what I mean is just meeting people and building relationships with them. And one of the people that I had met was an executive, C-suite level executive. And he and I stayed in touch throughout my senior year of college. He even knew when I, went off to this consulting firm, he knew that I was going to go do that. And he was wishing me well. There was no bad blood. He realized that it was a really exciting opportunity for me. But when I had those few last straws where I was like, no, I cannot, this is not the life I want to design for myself. I reached out to him and said, hey, this is not what I envisioned. We sat down, we had a little conversation. And I was like, hey, this isn't what I envisioned. I thought I was getting into one thing, I'm getting another. This has given me so much more clarity that I actually want to go work at T-Mobile. And so he was able to draft up. Being friends with a corporate executive has its perks. So he was able to create an opening for me, draft up a job offer, and I was able to pivot away from that really, what could have been a really, really unpleasant career. I was able to pivot out of it pretty quickly just because of the network that I had built and the relationships that I had maintained. I'll pause there. That was a big story.
No, that's awesome. And I had such a hard time. First of all, I'm laughing at myself because I'm like, I've been putting off putting these podcasts on video for so long that now I'm like, I feel like everyone's going to see me like on the edge of my seat and like biting my tongue because I try not to interrupt everyone during their corporate detox story. But oh my gosh, there were so many things that you said. The toxic masculinity, the making fun of people because they have, in my opinion, responsibilities, right? Like as a parent, crap like that used to get under my skin so bad. Like, yes, my headlights do work, but also I need to go home and make dinner for my son and get him in bed and have some sort of life outside of work. That's what, I remember people that I would work with. What, don't your headlights work? Yeah, they do actually. But, and that's what they normalized, this working 10, 12-hour days. And, if you didn't do that, if you only worked 40 hours, you were a slacker.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy to even think about these days.
Yeah. And I was so fortunate. I do want to bring up that if this was my first job out of college, I don't know that I would have realized that that's not okay. I attribute my ability for those red flags to go off when they did because I had that other experience to compare it to. I had that 3-month internship at a company that I loved, that I really feel like my values resonated with. Mm-hmm. I had something positive to compare it to. I still love T-Mobile and the experience that I had there. I'm willing to name them for one thing on this
Yeah,
podcast because I had a
absolutely.
really positive experience there. But I don't know, just for folks who are listening, who might be stuck at a job that they've had for, 10, 15, 20 years, and you're like, well, this is the norm. I'm used to feeling like I'm being, taken advantage of, or I can't take time off to, I don't have kids. I didn't have kids at the time. I didn't have any responsibilities, but I still wanted to enjoy my evenings, go for a workout, be able to unplug completely. Um, but yeah, just want to put it out there. If you are, have been stuck at the same role for a long time in the same company and you're thinking, well, this is the norm, everybody else has it. That's not necessarily the case, right? There's plenty of jobs out there. There's plenty of companies out there that realize the value in treating people well and giving people rest and, creating a positive culture. And sometimes it might just help to, I think when you're in your own little silo, it's hard to imagine something else. So I just want to put out some encouragement for folks if you are struggling with that, and encourage you maybe start reaching out to people who look like they're happy with their work, or look like they, have a good work-life balance, and just hearing the stories from them. I think just hearing that there's hope can be
Yes.
really beneficial to a lot of people.
Yeah. I was one of those people that did not have the opportunity to work for someone with a good culture. So when I was hourly through college, and then once I graduated, got hired in as management, right? So that was my first salary position, and I truly thought that that was what it meant to be salary, right? To hold a management position. Not just because of that company, but it's also what I saw in my household. Like, my dad had a salary position and we hardly ever saw him.
Mm.
Right? I thought that was just what came with that money, that that exchange. I didn't know. And so many people that I worked with, it was the same deal. Right? They didn't know what was out there. They didn't know the cultures that were out there. So that's what led to our burnout, right? A lot of people leaving. And then once that happens, you see that that's not normal.
Mhm.
That's not
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah. Just being aware that there are other options out there is
Yes.
so powerful
Yeah.
for people. It's like it can be this way. Yes, there are a lot of companies that, do treat people as expendable, as, you should, if you're not committed. I have a friend right now who's stuck at a job where the CEO says things like, if you're not willing to work overtime, that's why we're gonna go hire people who are.
Yep.
So there's plenty of cultures like that to be found, but there's also cultures that are positive and are healthy. And I just think you're doing such a service for people, Amanda, just talking about this and normalizing that this is not the only way, that
Yeah.
there are better options in there. And even within cultures, right? You might have a very positive company that's
Mm-hmm.
really known for its positive culture, but one of the organizations, the VP or the leaders in that organization might have different demands. So even within companies,
Yep.
you might have different experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing all that up, because, sometimes I have people say, that they want to bring the good side of the corporate world. And I always have this fear that people listen to this podcast and they think that it's all bad. And that's not my intention with this, right? As hosting this podcast, it's really to be able to give people hope.
Yeah.
So if you are one of those people that you feel stuck, like, this is a way to hear other people's stories and know that there are other options for you out there and that you're not stuck,
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you for that. I do have to say, I'm terrible interviewing. Terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And I will tell everyone that. So yeah, like, I think that what you do is just so amazing, because no matter how good someone is at their job, right? And no matter how good of a leader they are, that doesn't always come through in an interview. And from my HR experience, it was really something that I worked hard with when I was, interviewing with other folks, to make sure that we would talk about if someone didn't interview very well, that we were still talking about their abilities, right? Like what they actually show us every day. Because I'm that person, like I I sweat, I will, I get really uncomfortable and I am like tongue-tied the whole time. So talk
Yeah.
more about the work that you do, because
Yeah.
I think that is so, so critical for some of the folks that are listening, because I know that there are people listening to this episode right now that want to go find a company with a good culture, right? Somebody that aligns with their values. And what's holding them back is the fact that they feel like they don't interview well.
Yeah. Well, this is so huge. And you touch on a pain point, I think, that a lot of my clients and people who find my content have. And that is, I pretty much only work with people who I somehow have magically, through strategy and marketing, have attracted people who are really high working, right? Like, or high achieving, like really
Yeah.
believe in doing hard work, going above and beyond. Um, and I'm lucky to work with those people. But even you can be the hardest worker there is. You can be super talented. You can be a fantastic leader, an amazing manager, an amazing teammate. But interviewing is still a skill that is completely separate from anything we do in the workplace. It requires you to be able to take a step back, look at the value that you bring to the company, be able to articulate your strengths and your skills and experiences that demonstrate those strengths and skills, and be able to stay calm under the pressure of presenting yourself in this kind of uncomfortable format, right? An interview is meant to be a conversation, but it's a little bit more formal and rigid than I think a lot of people are used to. So, you might be an amazing public speaker, or you might be an incredible project management, and you have no difficulty articulating yourself in front of a team full of 12 people about what the next step for this project are, or talking about the risks and issues of your project. But then when it comes to talking about yourself, when it comes to saying, answering the question, tell me about yourself, or what are your weaknesses, or give me a time that you failed, we end up stammering, because it's not. And I want to normalize this. It's because we don't use these skills on a day-to-day basis. It is like I said, it's a completely different skill set than anything that you probably do in your workplace. And so that's why it's difficult. That being said, the good news is, because it's a skill, it's not just something that you're innately born with. You can actually build it. You can develop it, as long as you're intentional and you understand, hey, here are the things that I need to work out. And where was I going? I think my mind just went a little bit blank, which is one of the things that I talk about in the interview process. Well, that's why so many people, there's so much stress around interviews, especially if you're unemployed. I know a lot of your folks are currently in jobs, especially if you are interviewing for a dream job, or if you're unemployed and you're looking for work. There's so much pressure on the interview itself. And there's also so much pressure to be able to articulate yourself in a way that feels, in a way that is clear and compelling, that I think a lot of us have what I just had, which is a brain fart, right?
Yeah.
We end up having, like, this is an experience I talk with a lot of my clients about, is your mind just goes blank. And that's actually, just as an aside, that's a fight or flight response.
Yeah.
Because when you build up, that's why I talk so much about mindset, is because when you build yourself up, when there's all this stress, when there's all these issues of self-worth and am I good enough, and I have to speak perfectly, and all this pressure that we're putting on ourselves, we're basically telling our body that it's time that we need to be in a heightened sense, or a heightened state. So we need to either fight, flight, or freeze. And a lot of us like to freeze.
Yeah.
That's also one of the things that I talk about with clients. I have a program called Interview Bootcamp, where I actually walk people through, here's how you build a case for yourself, here's how you figure out your talking points, and speak to them in a way that doesn't feel like you're going me, 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 me. Here's how you help. I think one of the things that a lot of people struggle with, and probably a lot of folks that are listening now, is, how do I talk about myself without feeling like I'm bragging? This is especially something that women struggle with, is I love helping a team. I love helping others. But when it's time to advocate for myself, I don't want to sound like a used car salesman. So how do we build those talking points but also speak to them in a way that feels like you're actually helping the interviewer make a decision rather than just tooting your own horn.
I'll tell you. So, as a female, I mean, you probably see this all the time, especially with your clients, but just out in life, right? Um, we have a hard time receiving compliments as it is. And I truly feel like that is what stops us from being able to talk about ourselves, whether it's in an interview or it's as a leader, right? Like we're always like, we don't want to say this is because of my leadership or, brag, so to speak, on what, I've been doing, but we're always flipping it to a team. And we might have been taught that that's what that's what good leaders do, right? That's what good managers do, is they're always promoting their team. But like, how do you promote yourself? And I feel this in my core. Like I still, just like you, I struggle to talk about what I do in my own business.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather send someone a link or say, just listen to my podcast. It's so much
Yeah.
easier than having to sit there and talk about myself.
And that's a really great point. One of the things that I will this is something that I coach a lot of my clients on when we do our one-on-one session, is it's really a matter of your framing, right? Mm-hmm. It's a matter of how you think about the interview process. If you think it's just putting together a list of things to brag about, it's going to feel really icky to those of us who are really other oriented, who are really not selfish. And so I like to think about interviews as we're actually helping the interviewer, the hiring manager, make a decision. And in order to make a decision, they need to have really, really clear communication from you. They need to know exactly what you are capable of doing. Because if you think about, there might be somebody out there who is better at articulating those things, or maybe they take credit for things that they maybe shouldn't take credit for. Mm-hmm. So what we're doing is in building our talking points and building our case, we're figuring out how do we convey the information about us in a factual way, right? It's not subjective. It's thinking about what are the experiences I have and what are my principles of leadership, not because I want to brag about those things, but because those are things I need to be able to convey to the interviewer so that they can make a decision if it's a right fit or not. And I think coming at it from a place of helping, serving, delivering that value rather than giving a presentation, I think is really important. The other thing that I recently talked about, a woman who I was coaching, she was interviewing for a C-suite position. She's actually having her interview tomorrow, I want to say. But bringing back, thinking of the interview as a conversation that you're having, and you are trying to figure out, what does this role need? What are they looking for this role? A lot of us think that we need to have everything fully baked before we go into a job interview. We have to have, yes, you should have some talking points. You should have some answers that you've practiced out loud. But really, in the job interview itself, you're going to find out more information about the role, about the team, about the expectations, about the things that the manager is struggling with and needs help with. And so going into that mindset of, I'm going to be a problem solver, ask some questions about, what is it that you're looking for help in, and seeing, can I serve you in this capacity? I think that can also help sometimes, is to remember that you're going to get more information during this job interview, and it's your job to help them understand, is this something that you can support them with or not?
Awesome. So if you were in an interview and one of the people interviewing you just had this terrible look on their face, right? And it was making you uncomfortable, maybe this happened to your client. I know that this happened to me. What is your piece of advice for someone in that situation?
That's such a great question. It's something I talk about all the time in my reels too, is there's so many, first of all, being aware of the fact that some people, the interviewer, the hiring manager, the recruiter, a lot of people want to keep a purposely neutral face and react. A lot of people really want to manage their reaction so that they're not introducing bias into the interview process,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they don't want to, they don't want to necessarily nod along and change your opinions, right? They want to be really uniform in how they present themselves to all of the candidates so that they're not swaying their interviewer, right? The interview. So
Yes.
really believing in that sense of neutrality. First of all, I think having an awareness of that, of their face may not be about me, is really important. Of like, this might just be what they're doing in order to keep a neutral process. I'm going to stay out of their head, I think is really important. But the other thing too is thinking about, if you're in the middle of an answer and they look really displeased for some reason, you can always check in, right? As you would in a conversation. You can always go, I want to pause there. Is this along the lines of the type of answer that you're looking for? Or I just want to check in, is this the direction that you're hoping to take this in? Or should I pick a different example or something else to talk about? Like, you can always check in.
Oh, I like that.
I think the other thing is staying out of other people's heads, because you never really know. And I think this is especially women are really programmed to always be mind reading and trying to figure out what's going on in the other person's head. And what that does is it takes us out of the moment. We're no longer present. We're no longer focused on delivering our own compelling message. We're now trying to guess what the other person is thinking, which is, first of all, you're never going to know. And secondly, it's not going to be helpful either way. So coming back to, if you catch yourself doing this, and this might be not just in an interview setting, but, you might be talking to a coworker and they might be having like a, what is it? What's the acronym for it? RBF. They might be having a little bit of a RBF. And just remembering like, hey, it's their business. Like, what they do with their face is their business. I'm just here to be authentic. Right. And I think authenticity, that reminds me, authenticity is one of the things that people struggle with most.
Yeah.
In interviews, is how do I talk about myself? How do I show up in this context without feeling like, I'm trying to be somebody else?
Yeah.
And sticking to, what, having this attitude of, I'm going to tell them what I'm here to say. And I don't need them to validate me with their face. Like, I'm going to be happy. Like, my metric of success is how well I said what I needed to say, not what their face is. Because ultimately, and some people just have faces that, are like that, right? Like, some people, you're talking to them and they look really unhappy. I think we keep talking about women and men here. But I think women also tend to be very, and some men too, but tend to be very giving in terms of their facial responses, right? Doing a lot of nodding, engagement. I don't know if this
as I say here, nod my head. Yeah.
This is a very important. As a coach, like I'm very animated like that too. And this might be too, like, you might be a little bit, one person you're talking to might be a little bit more introverted. There might be a little bit more to themselves. I remember when I was interviewing for the consulting role that I was in for 2 months, I was interviewing with a partner and I was doing like a business case in front of him. And I was like, for sure, this guy hates me because he has a straight face. He is not giving me any sort of leeway. And I was the top 4, right? I was one of the 4 people that were picked out of my entire graduating class for that role. So you never really know what's going on in that other person's head. And it's not really your business anyway, because it might be in your favor, right? If it means nothing, but then you allow yourself to spiral and make it into something, that's when you start stumbling over your own words. That's when you start forgetting what you're going to say. So it's got to be a practice of mindfulness of like, oh, I see my brain has started to think about something that's not helpful, i.e. the other person's thoughts. Let me rein it back in.
Man, I wish I had you in my world like 6 years ago or 7 years ago, because so when I was in the HR role, my district manager, like, he was one that was like, and I'm sure it probably was from a place of neutrality, right, during interviews. But I was like, dude, you're setting people over the edge just the way like your demeanor is. And it's just, to me, it was very old school, right? And I'm more of a like, okay, authentic. I wanted to see authenticity in an interview, but not everyone that's not what everybody wanted, right? So yeah, I wish I would have known you a long time ago
Oh, thank
to be able
you.
to bring this in, not only to the people interviewing, but to the people that were going to be conducting the interviews.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing I want to touch on in terms of authenticity, a really common mistake that a lot of people make as they prep for job interviews is writing out their answer
Yeah.
as if it's an essay, right? So if I'm your coach and I tell you, hey, Amanda, write me a few bullet points for what you would say to answer the question, tell me about yourself. You might go home and write out like, here's an essay about
Mm-hmm.
telling me about yourself. And then you might go, I'm not accusing you, Amanda. I'm just saying
No,
this is
but
what
you're true. This is
this is
true.
something that this is
Very
something I
true.
have to explicitly tell people is you might go home, write out a script, wordsmith it to death because we're really comfortable
Yeah.
writing, right? We're really comfortable being behind the scenes and having control over, this one document. So you might script something out and then you might try to memorize it because you're like, oh, I spent all this time finding the perfect language, finding the perfect flowery, way to describe myself. Now I have to memorize it. So those are kind of the two mistakes that I see a lot of people make that makes it really difficult to interview and makes you feel less authentic. That is scripting out your answers. That's writing out full paragraphs, right, rather than thinking about your answers in terms of talking points and examples. And then the second mistake I see is memorization. This is really difficult for two reasons. Number one, most of us are not paid actors. Most of us don't need to memorize on a day-to-day basis. This is a skill. Memorization isn't a skill most of us don't have. And so trying to memorize something is really difficult for us to then also regurgitate in the stressful setting of an interview. Very, very low chance of you succeeding completely. Second issue with that, did I say there's two issues or there's three? There's three issues. The second issue with that is that it doesn't give you any leeway or flexibility in case the question changes,
Mm-hmm.
right? If somebody asks, if you've prepared a question for, tell me about a time you had a conflict at work, but somebody asks you, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a customer, then the whole thing that you've memorized is now out the window and you don't trust yourself enough to be able to speak off the cuff or speak spontaneously. And then the third issue is it's just, I've talked to recruiters and it's very obvious when something is so over memorized and over rehearsed, it feels different. Like when I'm talking right now, when you and I are talking, we're having a conversation, right? None of this is scripted. None of this is like, oh, I've memorized something and it sounds engaging, right? But you can tell when somebody has memorized something and they're just regurgitating it. So I think a big thing, one of the things that I really teach, I don't mean to, I realize I'm like talking about mistakes. I don't want to scare anybody off of doing interviews. I just want to equip you with some knowledge so that as you are preparing, if you're thinking about having that job search, you realize number one, this is a skill. And so I don't need to take it personally if I feel nervous about it or if I'm not very good at it right away. It's like riding a bike, right? If you haven't done it in a while, you're probably going to fall the first few times. It's not going to be great. That's not a reason to not apply. That's not a reason to not apply to those dream jobs or to lower your standard for what you're willing to accept. That's rather a reason for you to start thinking about, how do I get better at interviewing? So how do I develop this skill? Not, okay, now I should avoid it altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Just want to put that out as a reminder. This is not discouragement. This is rather saying, here are some of the things that you should be thinking about as you are prepping for job interviews. So what I really encourage my folks to do is think of things in terms of bullet points, right? If 5 to 6 words, right? If you're thinking about, tell me about yourself, put together four high level things that you're going to talk about. You're going to talk about, hey, my past is I have a degree in marketing and I've been project managing for the last 5 years. I have, here are 3 skills that I'm really good at. I'm really passionate about bringing a team together to work on, complex projects. And I love hiking, right? Like thinking of things as high level bullets and then using all of your time, all of your interview prep time, not in writing the perfect answer or the perfect essay, but rather coming up with bullet points and then going in front of the mirror, this is when people are like, their minds break because they're like, don't tell me to do this. Cause it's like, if usually people need to hear this the most, but writing out your high level talking points and then spending most of your time practicing saying them out loud, because it's a completely different ball game to think about your answers or to imagine what you might say versus actually getting into that mind muscle connection, into that muscle memory of, here's me doing the uncomfortable thing of answering this question out loud. The more you do it, the less uncomfortable it's going to feel, the more natural it's going to feel. That's my other point is, if you're interview prepping, don't spend all of your time writing your essays, writing your, answers out loud, because you're not going to write your interview answers, right? You're going to be talking to another human being. So you spend most of your time figuring out your talking points and then speaking to them as if, I like to say, as if you are catching up with an old coworker over coffee. Like,
I
speak
love
in that
that.
conversational tone.
I love that. And that is always where I don't want to say messed up, right? But that's the route I always took when I was prepping, was like to be writing stuff out. And then when I would get in there, and even if it was the same question, right? If I knew, my brain would be like, oh, you messed that up, then it would throw me off for the rest of the interview. So thank you for those tips, because that's good.
Yeah. One more thing that made me think of is, I was listening to a podcast last week, and they were talking about how a lot of people who struggle to articulate with themselves, what you just mentioned is kind of that process of like judging yourself as you're talking.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, that's not good enough. I could have said it another
Mhm.
way. When I was practicing it earlier, I said it this one way, and now I said it not as well. And we all do this. And it's kind of a, almost like a perfectionism of
Yeah.
like, our speech has to be perfect in order for us to make a great impression. And that
Mhm.
perfectionism actually takes us out of the moment, makes it much more difficult to get our communication across. So almost the counterintuitive advice that I would share is, lower your standard a little bit, right? Don't aim for perfect communication, aim for good enough. Let
Yeah.
yourself stumble. I stumble in my reels. I flub up my words and like flip letters and say the wrong word all the time. But I don't hold myself, I try not to hold myself to the standard of perfect communication, but rather good enough. And that good enough is what keeps you in the game, rather than, distracts you with spiraling thoughts of, oh, I could have been better. And that's when you start to, ramble and all that stuff.
Yeah. So, do you help people who are maybe looking at working in different industries than they've always worked in?
Usually, I would like to get into that more, but usually most of the folks that are coming to me are looking for work specific, like
In
still
the same
more or less.
industry?
And yeah, I've pivoted industries a couple times. This is my
Yeah.
third career now. But
Yeah.
so I'm happy to talk to, any challenges that I might have had. Yeah, for whatever reason, I think the people who are coming to me are just still keeping in the
Okay.
same type of job, same industry.
Yeah. Good to know. Well, I came from retail, and I feel so strongly that folks in retail, for the most part, they feel like all that they are good enough to do or trained to do is retail, but their skill set is tremendous, right? And they can pivot easily into other industries and be an asset to a company. But I feel like a lot of the time is they just don't know how to talk about that. Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like the work that you do with clients is just so valuable.
Yeah, because we really have to, what it comes down is when you look at a job posting or a job description,
Hmm.
it's figuring out not what are the tasks that I need to do, but what are the types of activities and skills
Yes.
that I need to have.
Yeah.
And every job that you have has transferable skills.
Yep.
I worked so first 5 years of my career, I worked in corporate project management. That's where I ended up working at T-Mobile. Loved my work, loved my manager. The people I was working with were fantastic. I really feel like I should have. I didn't talk enough about the positive outcome of that career detox. Was a job that I was really happy with and felt really supported in. We had all sorts of growth opportunities there. But yeah, but the second job that I got laid off from there, and realized that I wanted to actually pivot and work in the film industry. I was always really
Mm.
interested in like, making videos, making films and movies. And that was a huge, sure, I had corporate project management experience. How the heck does that translate to basically manual labor that's
Yeah.
very highly technical? I was working with cameras that I've never touched before. But there were a lot of skill sets, right? So maybe I couldn't say, hey, I'm really good with this kind of camera, or I have, 10 years of experience working with this kind of camera. But I could say that I'm somebody who learns really quickly and I know how to communicate really effectively. So when I don't know something, I can actually go and problem solve, and I'm really resourceful. So, if I don't know how to work with this specific lens or this specific accessory, I can go, I can ask these people that I've networked with. I can research it online. I can ask good questions in order to help myself, right? There's some of those skills that maybe I didn't have the technical skills with working with the camera, but there were so many things beyond just um, there were so many interpersonal skills that carried over between jobs and do carry over between all sorts of different industries. It's just a matter of figuring out, being able to take a step back and go, how does this, what's the skill or the strength that I've built here?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's so much running through my head. Like, like I legit wish I had you 6 years ago.
Oh, thank you.
Truly. So let's talk about top tips, advice, right? That you would give our listeners. What would that be?
Do we want to go down the route of sussing out that unhealthy
Yes, let's
workplace?
go there. Let's go
Okay.
there.
I think some of the things, a lot of the things that my clients will come to me with is, how do I, we now, and, it's 2023 when we're recording this, it might be 2024 when it's released, whenever, but in this day and age, we have a really good vocabulary and awareness of what we call a toxic workplace or unhealthy workplaces, and some of the values and actions that, luckily podcasts like this exist where we have a deeper understanding of what's okay and what's not okay. And a lot of people are worried that, how do I make sure that I avoid that kind of workplace? Because in an interview, everyone's trying to put their best foot forward, right? The interviewee is trying to put their best foot forward. The hiring manager is trying to put their best foot forward. How do I make sure that if I leave this job, I had golden handcuffs on when I was, by the time I ended working at T-Mobile, I realized that I wanted to career pivot, but I had those golden handcuffs on where I was like, oh, I don't want to go start freelancing and build myself up from ground zero and take a pay cut and all this stuff. Like, I was really worried about leaving my golden handcuffs. So a lot of people, I think, are afraid to leave whatever position that they're in now because they think, oh, this is as good as it gets. Or what if I go somewhere else and I get burned? And this is something that you can very much look out for in the interview process. So a few things, I'll just kind of list them as they come to my head, but um, keep an eye out on how they treat you during the interview process. If they are super hurried, right? If they're trying to fill the role yesterday, and if they're in a really big rush, everybody who's hiring needs help, right? So everybody is going to be feeling a sense of, oh, we're missing something, and you could be potentially the one to fill it. But if they are, rushing you through the interview process and they're rushing you to accept the offer, it might be because a lot of people have recently left, or because they all sorts of reasons, but that's one of those. That's something to be mindful of, is, are they actually being mindful of everybody that they interview? Because the interview process does take some time. Some interviews or some job posts get filled faster than others, but it does take some time. So if you feel like they're really rushing to get through this, it could be because they've had too many people leave at the same time, or if you feel like you don't really have a chance to ask a lot of questions during the interview process, right? If they don't leave any room for questions, or if you have questions but you don't get a chance to follow up, that's one thing to look for. I think a lot of the things in the interview itself, I like to compare it to going on a first date or going on a date with somebody. nobody's going to tell you, hey, I'm actually a toxic employee, or hey, I'm actually, I'm really a bad person to be in a relationship with. But there's certain signals, there's certain things that we can look out for based on the way they talk about previous employees, right? Like, this is one of those things that if you go on a date with somebody and they have all these crazy exes, it's like, well, they're the common denominator, right? And this translates into if you're interviewing and your hiring manager is talking about how, they had past employees who weren't willing to do the work or weren't willing to put in the hours or whatever. If they're in any way negatively talking about existing or previous employees, that's a red flag for me. So you can kind of look out for the way that they talk. There's a phrase that the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. So looking at how do they talk about their team? How do they talk about the company? There are questions, of course, that you can ask during your interview to trigger some of those conversations, but a lot of it is just going to be you trusting yourself to listen to your gut as you're talking with somebody. Does it seem like they are somebody who's genuinely respectful, or does it feel like they're putting on a face? Our gut actually can tell us a lot.
Right.
Some questions that you can ask too, anything that, because I think a lot of the things with these unhealthy workplaces is sometimes they don't even realize it, right? They've normalized it so much that, they're not going to come out and tell you, oh, we actually have a huge turnover rate or stuff like that. So this is, you can look on websites like Glassdoor and salary.com, look at websites that review these big companies or companies in general and see what previous employees have to say about it. That's, a way that you can do some research ahead of time, not so that you're not just, depending on one person to get your insight, but even asking questions of, at the end of your interview of like, can you tell me about what are the traits of somebody who is really, what are the traits of somebody who is going to succeed at this company, and watching out for what they answer, right? If they answer, oh, it's somebody who's willing to, work overtime all the time. And, if you start sensing that there's that cutthroat competition there, like not afraid to, take other people, whatever, there's red flags as this person is answering this question, that'll come up. Another thing is, what do you think? Kind of the opposite of that is, can you tell me about somebody who wouldn't be successful in this role? Or can you tell me about some traits of somebody who would struggle in this role and why? Or you can also ask them about what are some, if you're talking to the hiring manager or the team, can you tell me about a time that there was somebody made a mistake on this team and how it was resolved? Or can you tell me about a time that somebody disagreed with a policy? It's almost like taking those questions that you get asked and flipping them on reverse. And the point of that is going, well, tell me about times that your team has struggled and how were those challenges resolved? Or so bringing up some of those things is better, I think, than directly going, hey, tell me about the team culture. Because those are questions that they've prepared for, right? And that's an area that they can flub a little bit. But the best way to find out if you're going to be set up for success is, number one, figuring out what they think success looks like at the company and seeing if that matches what you're willing to put in. And then number two, asking them about, their previous experiences when people have made a mistake or had performance issues or weren't doing so well. How were they supported? Were they supported at all? That's when you're doing a little bit more of that reading between the lines to figure out, okay, is this somebody that I can see myself working with? Another thing is too, like keeping your options open. If you're interviewing somewhere and it feels like, this manager seems like they're really demanding, they don't feel like they're, I think I'm hearing some red flags that they're expecting me to work crazy hours. Or they're not even sure what it takes to be successful here. That's not your only option, right? Like if you've got there's, sure, it might be a little bit of a tougher time now, but there's lots of jobs out there. There's lots of companies that are hiring out there. So knowing that you have options, I think, can be really powerful too.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So I was like losing it while you're going through all those, because I'm thinking back to the times that I sat in interviews as the person going, like conducting the interview, right? And I was thinking back to all the times where some of those things were the reality, right? There was a mass exodus. That's how I like to say a lot of turnover, like mass exodus. And we had to hurry up and get, somebody hired for these positions like yesterday. And, going back to the work week. So I remember there would be people, they would go through a preliminary interview sometimes, and they would be told that 55 hours was our expected work week. And if that wasn't corrected on the second interview, they would walk into a reality that was like the expectation was a lot more, right? So 55-hour work weeks was actually not happening very often. I don't know. It's just funny how you were talking about some of these things, and I'm like, dang, like that was what we lived. And if people would have asked those questions, would we have been more forthcoming with that? Right. And I say we because I was part of that. I mean, that's all I knew. And that's what we were supposed to do, right? We were supposed to say to people. But after a while, you catch on that that's not right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can even ask, like, the first thing that you mentioned there is like having a mass exodus of employees. You can ask things like, what are the current struggles that your team is working through? Like, what are your current challenges? Or you are also very much allowed to ask, why is this role open? Why is this position open? So asking some of those questions, you can't necessarily be out, so direct as to say, hey, is everybody getting fired here? But one thing you can also look for is how many positions have been posted, in the recent few days, in the recent few weeks by this company.
Yeah.
Is it
or
just
are
a handful?
consistently posted, right?
Yes.
Like if there's consistently postings out, and I'm not saying that like it seems like everywhere is hiring, but I feel like that should be a flag too on how long are people staying, right? If you're consistently seeing a now hiring sign or a posting for positions that are similar, and that company's not in a huge growth, that's a red flag.
Yeah. And you can ask about things like, where have people on this team gone to, right? Like where have they moved on to once they've done this position, or once they've done this role, once they've been on this team for a while? What's their trajectory typically like?
Yeah. I love that. I love knowing what the promotability is within a company, and that you're not just going to go into a position that that there's not the opportunity, right? That it's, stagnant, so to speak. So
I think the other thing that's really important that we haven't talked about yet is being really clear on your own parameters and your own requirements. So when you're asking questions about, typical hours or workplace culture and expectations, asking about, expectations around holidays and evenings and weekends, all those kinds of things, getting clear before you even step into that interview. What do you want? Right? Are you willing? Like, some people are fine working a 50-hour work week. If the job is good enough, they're fine doing that. For me, it's a heck no, right? Like if it's like, so understanding your own expectations and your own preferences, so that when you go in, and if they give you an answer, so the flip side of that is, you go in, you haven't really thought about like, oh, am I willing to work a 50-hour work week, or is the 45-hour work week like a must for me? If you don't have clarity about that, and then you go in and you have a conversation with somebody and they're like, oh yeah, typically 55-hour work weeks, and they might be flubbing it a little bit, then because you haven't thought about that, you're more likely to be swayed into that situation. Right? So having that clarity before you enter the room, so that once you get there, once you have that information, you know what to do with it. Otherwise, you're going to just be like, oh yeah, I'm open to it. That's one of the reasons that I actually left working in the film industry, when I first, was networking and asking people about it, I knew that it was, 10-hour days, that it was a long, intensive, that it was a lot of work on your feet to be. I mean, I know there's jobs out there that are much harder, but I'm a corporate person. I'm a sit at your desk, clickety clack. But that's one of the things I realized about myself is when I was first talking to people who are working in the industry, and I was asking them like, hey, what is it like to work here? I hadn't really made it clear for myself that I actually don't want to work weekends.
Yeah.
I want to work, 9 to 5-ish hours in the film industry, but I didn't have clarity into that. And so I went into the film industry with an openness to working on weekends and working, 10, 12-hour days. When in reality, I think if I had thought about it before talking to people, because when you're in that conversation and they go, oh, it's probably a 10 or 12-hour day, you're in that very like, I'm trying to impress them mindset. And if you haven't given it much thought, then, or you don't have really clear parameters for yourself, then you're more likely to sign up for something that maybe if you had given it a little bit more thought, you would have backed out of, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So do you work with your clients on kind of creating what they want? Like, I look at that as like being able to dream, right? Because sometimes we get in these positions and we feel stuck. We don't know what's out there. And like our ability to like dream and think bigger has ceased to exist, so to speak. So do you work with clients on that?
Usually by the time people are working with me, they're already in the interview process. They've got interviews lined up. But one way that does show up in the way that I work with people is kind of the same way that we just talked about, is being clear on what you actually want for yourself.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, especially when it comes to asking questions for your interviewer and learning more, they're afraid to ask questions because they don't want to look like they're off-putting.
Yeah.
But empowering people that, hey, like, would you want to work somewhere? Like, I'm struggling to think of an example. I know I have a couple, and I'm sure as soon as we get off of this interview,
No, it's okay.
I'll think of some.
So like for me, when I work with clients, that's usually one of the very first things that we do, right? Is to be able to sit down and look at, I use a method called the vision integration method. And it's really like a holistic look of where you are and where you want to go. And it's not so much of like a 5-year, it could be like a 3-month, like in 3 months, where do you see this? But what it does is it gets those wheels turning, right? On, oh, I haven't thought about my spiritual aspect of my life. I haven't thought about like my friendships or my relationship with finances. It's not necessarily like how big's your bank account, but like what is the relationship and what do you want that to be? And that really starts those wheels turning to say like, oh, like I don't want to, like in your example, work weekends. I worked weekends for like 18, 19 years or longer. I don't want to work weekends anymore unless I want to, right? Unless it's something that I like feel really called to do. I'm all for it, but I don't want to be forced to do that. And really know they're non-negotiables.
Yes.
So for me, a non-negotiable is like, I want to be able to take my son to school and pick him up. Like those are my 2 non-negotiables. Because for so long, I was, he was one of the first kids to daycare and one of the last kids to get picked up. And when you talk about like guilt, there's a lot of mama guilt in there because of that. So for those of you listening, maybe you're at a place where you're like, I know that in 2024, I'm going to start applying to jobs and interviewing. I really challenge you to sit down and do that soul searching, right? Of really that dreaming again of what that looks like. I have a couple ways people can work with me and do that. A shorter session called a dream catcher session, and another one it's a little bit longer that we do a little bit more of a deeper dive. But I really feel like that can really help someone to be able to step in and confidently answer the questions, right? Confidently know that like this is not a good fit for me. And not get themselves in a position where they're just essentially replacing one job with another job that they are not happy in.
Yeah. That's so important. It's just to have that clarity of what you're looking for. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people nowadays are applying for every possible job that they're even remotely qualified for without
Yes.
even thinking about. And I don't coach job search strategy, but this is one of the things I inevitably talk about is um, narrowing down instead of spraying and praying, as
Yeah.
so eloquently called, applying for everything, hoping for something. And you're doing that kind of blindly. Instead of doing that, actually sitting down, thinking about what is it that I actually want? What kind of culture do I want to work with? What's the industry? What's the
Mm-hmm.
scope of the projects? What kind of impact am I having? Not necessarily that you go work for a nonprofit. Impact doesn't necessarily mean you go work for a nonprofit and save the world. It means, what kind of customers are you working with? What kind of clients? What kind of problems are you solving? Right? Getting really clear about that. And then that actually gives you, when you narrow down your job search, when you narrow down what you want, you actually become a much better match for it
Yes.
because then you're intentional. There's so many people that go into interviews. I've heard this from recruiters of they're going in and they sound like they're reusing the same generic script over and over again for
Mm-hmm.
their interviews, right? They're saying the same thing. It's sounding vague, rehearsed, recycled. But what really people want at the end of the day is somebody who's really excited to work there. And if you go through the process, like Amanda just outlined, of like getting really clear about what you want from your life, your career, and then you only pursue those things, then by the time you get to the interview with those roles, you're going to be able to very clearly articulate why you're there, and not
Yeah.
just because, oh, it was a job I saw that was posted and I'm not really sure why I'm here.
Yeah.
Right? It's a much more compelling case of like, hey, I know I have 1,000,001 options, but I'm only going to go for these three. You're actually increasing your chances of succeeding there because you're being much more intentional. And that's
Yeah.
going to show up in the way that you communicate and the research that you do, rather than spreading yourself out too thin.
Think of how magical that combination of being able to dream again, set that vision, and then enlist Tally's help with being really confident in your interviewing, and how that's going to help land you a job that is fulfilling to you. So I hope that this episode is giving you hope, of course, but also is like starting a little bit of a fire in your belly that you're going to go out there and start making moves that's different than what everybody else around you is doing. Right? So, Tali, go ahead. I want you to share with everyone how they can connect with you, and anything else that you have to share with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the best way, I actually, since April of 2023, have been posting short 1.5 minute reels 3 times a day, Monday through Friday, everything about interview tips, interview confidence, how to answer different questions, how to deal with weird, awkward scenarios. That's on social media. I'm on TikTok. It's at Tali Schlafer. So TALI.SHLAFER on TikTok. Same with Facebook and Instagram. You can follow me wherever. I usually cross post the same stuff across there. Really active on those platforms. I also have an interview mindset reset handbook, and that's my little freebie that I hand out. It takes 20 different fears and worries that you might be having about the interview process, like I'm not good enough, or there's other job candidates that are better for this fit than me, or for this role than me, and it turns them into more, it gives you suggestions for different ways to look at it, or different ways to reframe it. So if you're thinking, oh, if your fear is that there's probably a candidates that are a better fit than me, then I'll give you 5 or 6 different affirmations or mindsets that you can borrow to help you think about that in a more confident and empowering way, so you kind of get out of your own way there. And then I also have if you actually want to work with me one-on-one, I've got my interview boot camp, which is a 3-day fundamentals video training course to help you figure out your best talking points and how to level up your answers to really build a compelling wow message for your interviewer. And then a one-on-one coaching session with me to work through any questions you have, any imposter syndrome, insecurities, flesh out some of those talking points a little better, whatever you need support in. So those are kind of I've got my socials, the freebie, and then how to work with me one-on-one. I think I covered them all.
So for anyone that is listening or watching this, everything will be in the show notes. If you are watching live, make sure that that you check out probably the comments. I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. But anyways, if you're watching the live stream, we'll get the information to you. So Tali, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And I'm so glad that we're actually rounding out the year with this conversation. Like, this is perfect. And I can't wait to have you on again, because I know that we've talked. There's like a ton of things that you could bring to our listeners that would be a huge help.
Thank you, Amanda. This has been wonderful. And you're doing really, really amazing work in terms of getting people out of their ruts. Sometimes it's just having, like we talked about, having that awareness that there's better options available to you, that you can have a career that feels better and works with your life instead of against it. And I think building that awareness and giving people the vocabulary around that is just so important. And I wish I had that as a little bit more reassurance. Maybe I wouldn't have been at that job for 2 months. Maybe I would have just been there for a week before leaving. But I know there's a lot of people.
Thank you. I received that. I received those kind words. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, are you ready to start your own corporate detox journey? Well, if you are, make sure that you check out amandamcwhorter.net for different ways to work with me, as well as some freebies that could help you get started. If you're on social media, follow me at Amanda K. McWhorter on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram.